Good morning, students. Today we are going to talk about Victorian era. In this class, we are going to discuss two important key points. First, what is Victorian age, its introduction, and secondly, we are going to talk about the characteristics of the age. This age basically has four characteristics which include Victorian Realism, Victorian Compromise, Utilitarianism, and Agnosticism. But first, let us take what is Victorian age. Let us introduce the age. Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, and it was during the period between 1830 and 1840 that many of the writers who were to add special distinction to her reign began their work. But though her own life extended till 1901, we may conveniently take the year of her jubilee 1887 as marking the close of this last epoch in our survey. By that time, a fresh race in literature had arisen, while those of the former generation who still survived had nothing of importance to add to their production, and indeed, like Tennyson's Beverley, found themselves among new men, strange faces, other minds. Also, we can say that this particular age was wonderfully rich and varied in personal quality, and its astonishingly variety is one of its outstanding characteristics. The literature of the age of Tennyson at the same time everywhere embodies the spirit of Victorian England and reflects the influences which combined to make the half-century in question an era of surprising change along many lines. It is such a literature as in the mass could not conceivably have been produced at any other time in the world's history. The enormous complexities of the period and the bewildering diversity of the elements which entered into civilization render exhaustive analysis within brief limits impossible. But it is fortunately not difficult to indicate the two great dominant movements or main currents, as Brandes would call them, in the general life of the time. They are, in the political and social spheres, the progress of democracy, and in the intellectual sphere, the progress of science. So we can conclude by this particular paragraph that basically Victorian age was the age of the progress of democracy and also the progress of science. We can also say that in the Victorian age, more significant and more vital were the social and intellectual changes by which they were accompanied, as in the breaking down of the old feudal landmarks and distinctions, the more and more general recognition of the claims of the many against those of the long privileged few, the growth of sympathy between man and class, and the spread of popular education with all the increased opportunities for personal development which this entailed. Beyond any other period in our history, the Victorian age was an age of social interest and practical ideas, and it was by these that much of its literature was inspired and fed. For proof of this assertion, we need only to turn to the works of such writers as Carroll, Ruskin, Dickens, Kingsley, and Mrs. Browning. We can also say that Victorian age had closed, it had completely revolutionized all current ideas about nature, man, and society. A vast upheaval in thought was the consequence of this rapid progress and popularization of knowledge. New theories came into conflict with the old faiths. The ancient intellectual order was shaken at its foundations. Hence, the Victorian age was marked throughout by the prominence of the spirit of inquiry and criticism, by skepticism and religious uncertainty, and by spiritual struggle and unrest, and these are among the most persistent and characteristic notes of its higher literature. At the same time, the analytical and critical habit of mind, which was fostered by science, profoundly affected literature in other ways, and a marked development of realism was one conspicuous result. Finally, we must recognize the far-reaching changes which were brought about by practical application of science to life in the railways, the steamship, and the telegraph. By breaking down the barriers which had hitherto separated town and country and nations, by facilitating travel and the intercourse of different peoples, and by making the transmission of thought easy and rapid, these mechanical agencies did much to destroy the old provincialism, to help the progress of democracy, and to change fundamentally the spirit of the world. They have therefore to be included among the chief social forces in the literature of Victorian England. Now, this much is for the discussion of what Victorian age is about. Now let us take in detail what are the characteristics of Victorian age. Let us take one by one. The very first characteristic of Victorian age is the Victorian Realism. What do you mean by Victorian Realism? Coming down to the history of English literature from the Romantic age of idealism to Victorian era of realism, one experiences the feeling of a return from solitude to society, from nature to industry, from concepts to issues, from optimism to agnosticism, from lyricism to criticism, and from organicism to compromise. The second point that we discuss is Victorian Compromise. What is Victorian Compromise? The Victorian Compromise was a combination of the positive and negative aspects of the Victorian age. First, the expansion, great technology, communication, and colonial empire. Second, poverty, injustices, starvation, slums. Whereas the Romantics could afford to withdraw from the town in the initial stages of the industrialization, the Victorians, facing the flowering of the Industrial Revolution, had no such soft option available to them. Therefore, rather than living in solitude, writers of the Victorian age had to cope with the process of change in which the old agrarian way of life had to make the place for the new individual civilization. The third point that we discussed in the characteristics of the age is Utilitarianism. Against the chain of thinkers including Newman, Arnold and Ruskin, who were essentially religious, was the formidable force of utilitarian thinkers continued by J.S. Mill and agnostic scientists like Darwin, Spencer, Huxley, etc. Although utilitarianism was propounded by Jeremy Bentham, the philosophy came into operation during the Victorian era. Both the state and the industry came under the heavy influence of this mechanical approach to matters of the human soul. The celebrated principle, the greatest good of the greatest number, was the governing rule of the utilitarian thought on morals, laws, politics, and administration. And the last point for the characteristics of the age is agnosticism. Agnosticism is defined as the belief that nothing is known or can be known of immaterial things, especially of existence or nature of God. The term agnostics was coined by T.H. Huxley in 1869 AD. So broadly, we have discussed the important characteristics of the age and what Victorian age is about. We shall discuss this age in more detail when we pick up the important writers of this age, both in poetry and prose. In poetry, we have three important writers. We have Robert Browning, we have Alfred Tennyson, and we have Matthew Arnold. The poems of these poets will be discussed in detail, and along with the discussion of the poems, we will be taking up with the characteristics of the Victorian age, how these characteristics are found in the poets, and how they have exemplified the social and political realities in their works. Thank you, students. Thank you.